Hello listeners. Welcome to BookoMatic. We are back with a new book summary. So without wasting time, let's start. Author Overview. John Knowles was born in West Virginia in 1926. In 1941, at the age of 15, Knowles left home to attend Phillips Exeter Academy, a boarding school in New Hampshire, from which he graduated in 1945. Upon graduation, he spent less than 1 year in the Air Force and subsequently attended Yale University, from which he graduated in 1949. Upon graduation from Yale, Knowles was employed as a freelance writer as well as a journalist. It was Knowles' friend and fellow Yale alumnus Thornton Wilder who convinced him to continue his pursuits as a writer, and he was successful in publishing numerous short stories before having his first novel, A Separate Piece, published in 1959. Though Knowles had 8 other novels published, none of them had the success of his first. A Separate Piece has been critically acclaimed and continues to be very successful to this day. Now let's start with the brief summary of the book A Separate Piece. Chapter 1. The novel opens with a grown Jean Forrester, whose name is not actually revealed until the 3rd chapter, revisiting Devon School, the boarding school he attended in his adolescence. He is disappointed that the school has not changed in 15 years, as he thought it would have aged with him. He begins to tour the campus and describes the buildings in great detail, which seems vibrant despite the fact that his surroundings are grey and wet as he is in New Hampshire in November. He finds himself in front of the school's famed marble staircase, which is so hard that it is not even worn down after all of the years it has been there. He feels that Devon has changed, though notes that he still fears some fear at being there. Jean heads to the tree at the river that changed his life at Devon, noting that it is bigger and wearier looking than he remembers. The story flashes back, and Jean is a boy of 16 standing by the tree with his friend Finney. Jean does not want to climb the tree, despite the fact that Finney insists that they should. There are 3 other boys standing by the tree with them, including Elvin Lepellier, leper. The boys are all deciding whether they are going to climb the tree and jump off it into the river, which Finney thinks is a great idea. Finney strips down, and the narrator comments on his athletic build and proceeds to climb and jump out of the tree. Jean feels he must live up to everyone's expectations and do the same. Once Jean is in the tree, he mentally freaks out a bit because he fears that if he does not jump out far enough, he will smash his head in the dirt. He begins to resent Finney for getting him into this situation, and then he jumps. None of the other boys would jump, making the bond between Finney and Jean stronger than ever before because they were the only ones brave enough to do it. It is summer session, so there are few students around and no headmaster. Finney tells Jean he did a good job once he was pressured to jump, as Finney apparently always teases Jean. The 2 boys stop and wrestle rather than running when the dinner bell sounds. Realizing they are too late for dinner, at this point they return to their dorm and do homework while listening to the radio they smuggled in. Chapter 2. The next morning, a substitute teacher, Mr. Prudhomme, confronts Jean and Finney for missing dinner the night before. Rather than try to make up an excuse for why they missed dinner, Finney simply told Mr. Prudhomme the story what happened the night before, the beautiful day, the tree jumping, and the wrestling. The boys managed to get away without being punished, due to Finney's ability to be boisterously friendly and charm the pants off of everyone. When the boys get dressed that day, Finney puts on a pink polo shirt in honor of the US having bombed Eastern Europe, though Jean picks on him for looking gay. That afternoon the boys are set to have tea at the home of their substitute headmaster, Mr. Patchwithers. It proves an awkward experience for all of the boys and faculty involved, though true to form Finney is the epicenter of lively conversation. In the midst of conversation, Mrs. Patchwithers sees that Finney is using his school tie as a belt and is horrified. Jean expects that Finney will finally get into trouble, but alas he does not. Finney manages to talk himself out of yet another punishment and at the same time gets the very poker-faced Mr. Patchwithers to laugh. Jean is at first upset but then congratulates himself for being friends with such a specimen. As the boys are leaving the party, Finney suggests that they jump out of the tree together this time as a symbol of solidarity. While they are walking toward the river, Finney states that he does not believe the bombing really happened and Jean agrees, because to the boys at the school the war was just something they heard about rather than something they experienced, so to them, it was not real. After the boys swam for a bit, they climbed the tree together to jump in honor of the new society they formed called the Super Suicide Society of the summer session. Jean nearly falls off the branch, and Finney steadies him. Then they jump. Jean realizes Finney may have just saved him. Chapter 3. Jean decides that he does not actually owe Finney any thanks at all because he never would have had a near-death experience had Finney not pressured him to jump from the tree in the first place. Finney decides that other boys must be inducted into their society, and he creates a series of crazy rules, one of which states that Finney and Jean will jump from the tree together at the beginning of every meeting. The meetings occur every night, and Jean agrees to jump from the tree each time though he always fears he will fall. Finney is an adrenaline junkie only made worse by the fact that the athletic program in the summer is far inferior to the one in the normal school year, and Finney is an athlete. He proceeds to invent a game called Blitzball, which involves tossing a medicine ball around from boy to boy, with the boy holding the ball becoming a target, and no one ever actually wins the game. One day when Finney and Jean are at the school swimming pool all by themselves, Finney decides he wants to try to break one of the school records, which he does on the first try. Jean tells Finney to do it again in public, so Jean will not be the only one who has witnessed it, but Finney refuses and tells Jean not to ever tell anyone he did it. Finney decides that the two boys should take a trip to the beach, which is a couple hours by bike and is strictly forbidden by the school. Jean, of course, agrees, and the boys set out on their trip. Finney greatly enjoys himself at the beach, and, though Jean is not enjoying himself quite as much, Finney makes every effort to keep him entertained. They grab a hot dog for dinner and manage to get a couple of beers due to some forged draft cards they were carrying. The boys settle into to sleep on the beach and Finney tells Jean that he is his best friend and he is glad they came to the beach for the day. Jean almost tells Finney that he feels the same but changes his mind at the last minute and says nothing. Chapter 4. When the boys get back to school in the morning, they are just on time for Jean to take his trigonometry test, which he fails. Jean is very disappointed in failing his test, but Finney distracts him by playing blitzball and having a society meeting. Later that night Finney studies his trigonometry and Finney teases him for trying to be valedictorian. Jean denies his accusations, but when he thinks about it, he realizes that he does want to be valedictorian. Finney is the star athlete and Jean wants to be the star scholar to match Finney's athletic accomplishments. In the coming weeks, Jean really buckles down on his studies and Finney begins to study more as well. Jean believes in an effort to make himself a slightly better student because Jean is a fair athlete and being a fair student rather than a poor one would make Finney equivalent. Jean senses a faltering in his friendship with Finney because of the obvious jealousy, rivalry, and competition between them, but in an attempt to not reveal this feeling to Finney, Jean continues attending their society meetings. One night, Finney interrupts Jean's studying to tell him that Leper is going to jump from the tree that night, but Jean believes that Finney only convinced Leper to do it as a means to interrupt Jean's studying. As they head toward the tree, Finney tells Jean he can stay in and study, as he can tell that Jean is upset. Finney tells Jean that it is good of him to put so much effort into something he is good at and that he envies how intelligent and academically inclined Jean is. Jean tells Finney that he is done studying, and he wants to see Leper jump. Jean notes that there must never have been the rivalry between them that he sensed, and that Finney must definitely be superior to him as it seems obvious that he is incapable of jealousy. Jean and Finney climb the tree to jump together, as they do at the start of every meeting, but Jean's knees buckle, shaking the limb, and Finney falls to the ground with a heavy thud. Jean jumps into the water, finally fearless. Chapter 5. Word spreads around school that Finney's leg is shattered, though no one has been allowed into the infirmary to see him yet. Jean wrestles with the idea that he caused Finney to fall on purpose and wonders if it is true, though he does not seem to know. The only time he feels better about the situation is when he dresses up in one of Finney's outfits with his pink shirt, but the next morning he is overcome with guilt and anxiety again. Dr. Stanpole tells Jean that Finney is feeling better and would like to see him. He says that Finney's leg is shattered, and he will be able to walk again sometime, but he will never be able to play sports again, a revelation that causes Jean to cry. Dr. Stanhope tells Jean that he must stay strong for Finney. Jean, still feeling guilty, asks Finney what he remembers about the incident because he wants to know if Finney feels like it is Jean's fault that he fell. Finney hints at the idea that Jean caused the branch to shake on purpose, but immediately recants that notion as he feels terrible for bringing it up at all. When Finney tells Jean that he looked to him for support when he felt he would fall, Jean is outraged, believing that Finney meant to pull him down as well, but Finney says he was merely looking for support. Jean is about to tell Finney that it is his fault that the branch shook when the doctor comes in and sends Jean away. After that day, Finney is not well enough for visitors and is sent home to Boston as the summer semester ends. When Jean returns to school in September, he stops at Finney's house to see him before continuing his way to Devon. Jean tells Finney that he caused the accident, and Finney is outraged and refuses to believe the confession. As Jean is leaving, Finney tells him that he will be back at Devon by late November. Chapter 6. School has started up again for the fall semester, and Jean feels like there is something airy about the campus and that it is not the same as it was before. The relaxed teachers and supervisors of the summer are gone, and the strict teachers are back, disappointed by all of the rule-breaking they heard occurred over the summer. At the first church session of the new semester, the leaders encourage continuity of the standards of Devon, though Jean feels that they cannot go back to what was before because everything is different now in the wake of Finney's accident. He does understand that the rules that are impressed upon the students are for a reason as Finney got hurt breaking them. Jean feels alone in the dorm situation because he is still in the room he shares with Finney, only Finney has not yet returned to school, and also Leper has been moved to a different dorm, So there is a macho alpha male named Brinka Hadley living across the hall now. Jean is depressed by this change and feels alone. School sports have started up again, though Finney is not there to play them, and he will never be able to play again. Jean heads down to the river for crew practice, though it is not the river they spent the summer jumping into, it is the murkier river on campus called the Nagwamsit. Jean arrives at crew late and is harassed by Quackenbush, who is a total jerk and hated by everyone. Jean wants to be crew manager this year, a role usually reserved for someone who is disabled, and is goaded relentlessly for it. He and Quackenbush get into it a bit and end up in the water before Jean is asked to leave. When Jean returns to the dorm, he has a phone call, and it is Finney. Finney sounds very happy to hear Jean's voice and is happy that his spot as Jean's roommate is still open. In an effort to put aside Jean's confession that he caused Finney to fall, he tells Jean that he was awful crazy when he came to visit. Jean agrees with Finney and they begin to talk about sports, though Finney is disappointed when he hears Jean wants to be crew manager rather than actually participating. It is obvious that Jean feels he cannot play sports as long as Finney cannot, but Finney tells him that if he cannot play then Jean will play for him. Chapter 7. Brinker travels across the hall and into Jean's room, commenting that he is jealous that Jean gets such a large room all to himself. Brinker, seemingly joking, tells Jean he must have pushed Finney out of the tree just so he could live in the big room alone. Jean, feeling quite awkward with his guilt, laughs along with Brinker and suggests they go downstairs to the butt room in the basement and have a smoke. When the boys arrive downstairs, Brinker jokes with the other boys who are down there that he has brought the prisoner, Jean, who has tried to kill his roommate. Jean keeps joking along with the boys, never denying their accusations. When the boys ask Jean to reenact the scene for them, he feels strange about it and turns attention to a younger boy who does not realize the other boys are kidding to do the dirty work. When the boy confirms that he believes Jean must have pushed Finney out of the tree, Jean tells the others that he has to go study and leaves the room, never having smoked. The boys of Devon help to shovel the snow off the train tracks because labor is hard to come by during the war times and the soldiers need the train tracks clear so they can travel. Leper does not help the other boys but rather goes off on his cross-country skis to find a beaver dam he heard about. After the tracks are shoveled, a train of soldiers rides by and Jean notices that they all look happy and carefree and is jealous of the life experience they are all coming into. On the way back to Devon, the boys all discuss the idea of leaving school and enlisting, though some of them, like Quackenbush, would rather graduate before they join up. Back at Devon, the boys see Leper coming back from his trip, and Brinker tells Jean that he is going to leave school and enlist the next day because he cannot wait any longer. Jean decides that he wants to do the same and will leave the next day as well, but then he returns to his room and finds that Finney has returned. Chapter 8. Finney immediately begins picking on Jean, mostly his clothes, which are extremely shabby and filthy after shoveling the tracks all day. Finney is upset that Devon does not have maid service this year, but Jean understands, unselfishly, that with the war going on, Devon is trying to cut back on expenses. The boys go to bed and Jean prays, which he did not do while Finney was gone. The next morning, Brinker Hadley bursts into the room, excited about the plans he and Jean have made about enlisting, but sees Finney and remarks that Jean's plan must have fallen through, obviously hinting toward the plan to kill Finney for the room. Jean explains to Finney that he was considering enlisting, though it is obvious that, with Finney being back, Jean will not be going anywhere. Jean feels that Finney needs him around and tells Brinker that he will not be enlisting with him. After Brinker leaves, Finney and Jean begin to pick on him immediately and dub him with the nickname Yellow Peril. When the boys are headed back from chapel, Finney muses that he loves the winter and, therefore, the winter must love him as well, because when you love something so much it has no choice but to love you back. He then decides that he and Jean should skip class in honor of his first day back so he can explore the campus. Finney wants to go to the gym, which is a long trek on crutches and tires Finney out, but he takes a deep breath and makes a grand entrance into the gym anyway. Finney wants to visit the locker room first, rather than the trophies, and then asks Jean what sport he is playing. Jean tells Finney that he did not go out for a sport, nor did he decide to manage the crew team, he is just going to gym class. Finney is flabbergasted and insists that Jean allow Finney to train him for the 1944 Olympics, as that is what Finney was going to do before he got hurt. Jean tells Finney that, with the war, there will be no Olympics, but Finney sticks to his story that there is no war and a bunch of fat old men made it up to keep the country in line, and tells Jean the reason he is privy to this information is because of the amount of suffering he has been through, a sentiment which both boys seem shocked was mentioned. Jean proceeds to do chin-ups, 30 of them at the urging of Finney. One day when Jean is running, he feels different than ever before, like he finally hit his stride, and Finney is impressed. When Mr. Ludsbury asks what they were doing, Finney tells him that they are training for the Olympics, and when Mr. Ludsbury tells him that all training must be for war purposes, Finney simply says to him, "No." Finney tells Jean that Mr. Ludsbury is too thin to be in on the fat old man plot. Chapter 9. Jean decides that he will go along with Finney's view that there is no war going on, not because he believes it but because it makes life more carefree and enjoyable. Lepper enlisted in the service, which came as a big surprise to everyone because he is the last person they expected to enlist. Some recruiters came to Devon one day and showed the boys videos of the soldiers skiing, which sparked Lepper's interest, and he decided that if he can ski as a soldier then he wants to enlist immediately. He enlisted just before he turned 18, so he was able to choose what he wanted to do, rather than be drafted and forced into something. Jean thought that if Brinker had gone in first then it would awaken the boys to the reality of the war, and they could stop pretending it was happening. But Lepper was not a significant enough member of the Devon community to have that kind of effect on the student body. From that point on, whenever the boys heard about something big happening in the war, like an attempt to kill Hitler, they assumed that Lepper must have been the one to do it, which made the war stories much more fun and interesting to discuss. Finney was the only one who did not subscribe to this mindset and instead immersed himself in training Jean for the Olympics, which was an attempt to keep Jean away from the war talk as well. Jean notes that Saturdays at Devon are extremely boring, and the boys must invent numerous activities to entertain themselves. One day Finney brings up the idea of having a carnival the following weekend, and Jean agrees. The boys come up with prizes to give away for the winners of the events, and Brinker even goes along with the idea and has fun with it, despite his recent role as a serious student. The boys drink some hard cider, start to have a good time, and Finney signifies the beginning of the games by burning a copy of the Iliad. Finney gets Jean to show off his Olympic skills, and soon after Jean gets a telegram. The telegram is from Lepper, who has escaped and is hiding at the Christmas location, and he wants Jean to come to him right away. Lepper signs the note, "Your best friend." Chapter 10. Jean leaves that night to go to Leper's house in Vermont, as it is obviously the Christmas location he not so cryptical mentioned in the telegram. Jean, as the narrator, muses that he would make the same journey many times in his life when he is in the military, though he never actually saw combat because the war was basically over by the time he enlisted. Jean tells himself that Leper has just escaped from some spies because there is no way that he escaped the army. Leper seems happy to see Jean, but he is acting strange. Leper seems extremely jumpy and emotional, and Jean asks him how long he is on leave before he has to go back. Leper tells Jean that he went a wall, absent without leave, before they could dismiss him for being mentally insane, formally called a Section 8. Jean is scared of Leper at this point because he is very different from the friend that left Devon. Jean lashes out at Leper out of fear, and Leper throws Finney's accident in his face, accusing Jean of pushing Finney out of the tree. Jean attacks Leper, which attracts the attention of Mrs. Lepellier. Jean tries to explain himself to Leper's mother and apologizes to her and stays for lunch at Leper's request because he felt bad if he refused the offer. After lunch, the boys go for a walk and Jean feels like being in nature will bring out the old Leper, though he is mistaken. Leper tells Jean about all of the crazy images and dreams he would have in the army about things transforming into other things. Jean feels really odd and uncomfortable around Leper at this point and starts yelling at Leper to stop telling him these things as they have nothing to do with him. He runs away from Leper's house right back towards the town and Devon. Chapter 11. When Jean gets back to campus, he wants to see Finney because Finney's mind is always on sports, rather than war. Ironically, Finney is involved in a snowball fight with some other boys when Jean returns. Jean is distracted by the way Finney walks. He used to almost float and now he seems so crippled, aside from the fact that his leg is in a cast. Finney asks about Leper and Jean keeps the gory details to himself. Jean tells Finney that he should be more careful and perhaps not do things like get into snowball fights because he may break his leg again, but Finney tells him that he thinks that once a bone grows back together it is stronger than it was to begin with. Later Brinker comes into Finney and Jean's room and asks about Leper. Jean tells the other two boys that Leper went a wall, and Brinker assumes correctly that Leper went crazy. Finney finally begins to admit that the war must be real because fake wars do not make people crazy. Devon becomes immersed in the war and everything to do with it while Brinker, one of the boys who most wanted to enlist, finds himself interested in anything that has nothing to do with the war. Brinker tells Jean that the reason he did not enlist is because of Finney and Jean does not confirm or deny this accusation. Brinker brings up the old joke that Jean pushed Funny off the tree, and Jean gets a little uneasy over the whole situation. One night while the boys are studying, Finney says that he saw Leper on campus, and Jean remembers that Leper thinks he pushed Finney out of the tree. So Jean gets very uncomfortable at the thought of him being back at Devon. Later that night Brinker invites Finney and Jean to come out with him and his friends as he has a set of keys to the whole campus from being involved in so many clubs. The boys sneak out and end up in the assembly room where Brinker immediately begins making fun of Finney's limp. Brinker begins asking Finney what happened on the day Finney fell, determined to get to the bottom of the whole situation, much to Jean's horror. Finney's story changes numerous times as it becomes clear that he does not entirely remember what happened that day. He even thinks the tree may have shaken itself on purpose. Brinker and his friends decide they need to bring in a witness and get Leper. Leper refuses to answer any questions about the incident as he does not want to implicate himself and says a few other crazy things. Finney gets angry at the spectacle, tells all the boys he does not care what happened that day and storms from the room. After Finney leaves the room, the boys hear him fall the very large, very hard, marble staircase. Chapter 12. Jean remembers every acting very responsible and exactly as they should in the wake of Finney's accident. They held him still while someone went to fetch Dr. Stanpole and the wrestling coach, Phil Latham. Jean finds it strange to watch Finney being carried out because the only person Finney has ever needed help from was Jean. In any other case, Finney was the one doing the helping. Dr. Stanpole says that Finney's leg is, in fact, broken again, but this time it is not shattered, it is a clean break and should heal just fine after surgery. All of the boys are told to go back to their rooms, but Jean finds himself crouching in the bushes in the dark outside of the infirmary rather than going to his room. He hears the conversation between Finney and the doctors and begins making jokes with himself while he waits. Eventually, once Finney is alone, Jean calls out his name and crawls through the window. Finney begins yelling at Jean, asking him if there is another bone in his body he would like to break while Jean apologizes fruitlessly. Jean leaves the infirmary, but rather than go back to his dorm, he wanders around campus, finding himself outside of the gym, which looks strange to him. Jean feels as though he no longer exists. Or maybe he never did, perhaps he was nothing more than a ghost all his years at Devon. Jean falls asleep leaning against the wall of the stadium. The next morning, Jean returns to the dorm and finds a note for him from Dr. Stanpole asking him to bring some of Finney's clothes down to the infirmary. Jean grabs some of Finney's clothes and sets out for the infirmary, feeling as though he is experiencing déjà vu, which, in a way, he is, as this happened just last summer. He gets to the room and finds Finney alone and tries to explain himself. Jean apologizes, just as he did in Boston, and Finney tells him that the whole situation would be different if there were no war because Finney feels helpless having a broken leg and not being able to fight. Jean tells Finney that he would be no good in a war anyway because he is too friendly and would probably try to make friends with the enemy. Jean and Finney agree that the tree situation was an accident and not intentional at all, and Finney goes in for surgery. When Jean returns to see Finney after his surgery, he is greeted by Dr. Stanpole, who tells him that Finney died during his surgery. It seems that a piece of marrow broke off and floated up to his heart, killing him. Jean tells the reader that he never once cried about Finney, not even at his funeral, because it would be like crying at his own funeral as Finney was a part of him. Chapter 13. As school was coming to a close that spring, some jeeps filled with troops rolled into the far common. Brinker and Jean went out to the common to see the greeting ceremony that is happening, and Brinker brings up Leper, but Jean does not want to talk about him or about Finney. Jean feels as though peace no longer exists for anyone, even at Devon, except maybe for the boys who were there during the summer session. Brinker introduces Jean to his father, who reminds Jean of one of the fat old men who made up the story of the war happening that Finney always used to talk about. Mr. Hadley likes to talk about war and the boys' responsibility to fight, which Brinker apologizes to Jean for, but Jean thinks he knows where Mr. Hadley is coming from. He thinks that Brinker and Finney were similar in the way that they tried to rebel to forget that the war was happening at all. Jean does not believe that war is the fault of the fat old men, but of ignorance in the hearts of many men. While Jean is clearing out his gym locker, he thinks about Finney as he often does, though he refuses to talk about him with anyone because Finney is not dead to him. Finney's way of living still resides in Jean, even as he is telling the story. Finney never had any hatred for anyone or any enemies as most people did. Jean says that most people find something to hate and spend their whole life making that one thing their eternal enemy, though Finney never did that. Jean says that he went to war though he killed no one and never hated any of his opponents because he knew Finney would not have. Jean says that the only enemy he ever had he killed while he was at Devon. Thank you so much for listening this audiobook's summary. Goodbye for today. See you again with a new book. Till then, stay tuned. Keep reading books. If you like today's book, then hit the like button. And if you new and not subscribed us till now, then what are you waiting? Subscribe our channel now. And press the bell icon to stay updated. Happy book listening.